Dover, Pennsylvania. So glad you've joined us today. We are continuing in our study of the prophecies of the Bible, what have come to pass and what have yet to come to pass. For those of you who have been following along but have missed a few episodes here and there, don't worry about it. Every single one of these episodes will be available on DVD upon the completion of the series. Well, we last left off in the book of Isaiah, chapter 13. We were in verses 6 through 16. So let's go there right now. In verse 6, it says, "Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty." So verses 6 through 16 all deal with the day of the Lord, and each individual detail describing the day of the Lord is its own prophecy, which we'll now look at. Starting in verse 9, prophecy 1581, it says, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it." So, the day of the Lord is going to accomplish the destruction of all sinners. Anyone who is still on earth and is not right with God will be wiped out. And in verse 10, prophecy 1582, it talks about the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon should not cause her light to shine. Now, Christ would actually repeat this verse in his own words in Matthew chapter 24, in his description of the end times. Let me read that to you. Starting in verse 29. "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." So, that right there tells us the specific time of the day of the Lord. It will occur immediately after the tribulation. Verse 11, it says, "And I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible." That's prophecy 1583. The arrogant and the proud will be humbled. Then verse 4, prophecy 1584 and verse 12 says, "I will make man more precious than fine gold." That talks about there will be so few men left after the day of the Lord, they'll actually be rarer than gold. Verse 13 says, "Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger." Now, when I read those words, I automatically think of an earthquake. And in the book of Revelation, there are two mentions of earthquakes. The first one being in Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. I'll read that to you. It says, "I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood." The second mention of earthquake is found in Revelation chapter 16, verse 18. I'll read that. Here we go. "And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since there were men on earth." Now, this verse not only refers to an earthquake, but also thunderings and lightnings. which lines up where it says, "Therefore I will shake the heavens." So I believe this is the verse which Isaiah 13:13 is referring to. Then in verse 14, actually verses 14 through 16, it talks of, this is prophecy 1586, it talks about the fleeing of peoples. It says in verse 14, they shall flee as the chased roe, which is a deer, I believe, and as a sheep that no man take enough, they shall every man turn to his own people and flee everyone into his own land. But it also says, everyone that is found shall be thrust through, and everyone that is joined unto them shall fall by the sword. That means there's going to be no escape, more or less. Verse 16 says, their children also shall be dashed to pieces before their eyes, their houses shall be spoiled, and their wives ravished. Now, it might seem highly unfair that the children and the wives should suffer because of the sins of others. But understand something, it was their own sins that brought this devastation on them in the first place, so they really have no one to blame but themselves. Okay. Now we scoop down to verses 17 through 22. This talks about the impending judgment of Babylon. Verses 17 and 18, this is prophecy 1587, talks about how God will rise up the Medes against them, which happened to Old Testament Babylon, as was narrated in Daniel chapter 5. So this is talking about Old Testament Babylon. Then we move down to 19 through 22. Verses 19 and 20 talk about when Babylon falls, it shall never be inhabited, neither shall be dwelt in from generation to generation, and so forth. That's 1588. And 1589 is 21 through 22. It says, but wild beasts of the desert shall be there, and houses shall be full of doleful creatures. So there will be no inhabitants to where Babylon once was, only wild beasts and animals and every which ones. Could this be a reference to the fall of Babylon, the end times Babylon in Revelation chapter 18? It could. In fact, it's highly likely. But it also is likely it's talking about to the fall of Old Testament Babylon. It could be a double reference because right now because Babylon has never been rebuilt. As one brother of mine said to me, if you want to prove the Bible wrong, try rebuilding Babylon. Because and it's just not going to happen. Saddam Hussein actually tried to rebuild Babylon, and he failed. So once again, I believe this most likely refers to Old Testament and New Testament Babylon. We now move to chapter 14. Verse 1 it says, for the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. This refers to Israel within the millennial kingdom. Talks about the return of the house of Jacob to its land, and strangers shall be joined with them. That refers to converted Gentiles that will also be with them and will stand with them. That's prophecy 1590 again. And prophecy 1591 in verse 2 talks about, says, the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaids. This is talking to the enemies of Israel that had expelled them. says, in the end times, their former enemies will now become their servants and handmaids. Verse 3 is prophecy 1592. It talks about, it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give them rest. So this is talking about a rest that will come in the millennial kingdom, and that's what the millennial kingdom shall be. 1,000 years of rest before the devil is released from the abyss. I mean, how can you not have peace when the devil is all chained up in the abyss? Okay. Verses 4, 5, and 6. These three verses refer to the destruction of the Antichrist. Verse 4 talks about the king of Babylon. It says, "How hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased." And then verse 5 and 6 talks about the broken staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, the tearing down of the demonic king and the demonic kingdom, which is the Antichrist. And in verse 6, it talks about how it's all going to happen with one stroke. All the powers of hell God can take down with just one stroke. That's how powerful God is. And then verses 7 and 8, again, refers to the millennial rest. And then verses 9 through 11, this is a taunt to the Antichrist. The Antichrist, as you know, will be condemned to hell. And here it says, when the time comes for him to be cast into hell, he is going to be taunted. It says in verse 9, "Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet at thy coming." Hell is going to be opened up for the Antichrist. And then furthermore, it talks about all the chief ones of the earth that have raised up from their thrones, and all the kings of the nations. It talks about how all the former kings of nations will now look upon the once all-powerful Antichrist, and they will say to him in verse 10, "Art thou also become as weak as we? Art thou become like unto us?" I mean, wow. These are human kings taunting the Antichrist. I mean, this is quite a fall that the Antichrist is going to suffer. Then verses 12 through 15, prophecy 1596. This is a taunt of hell to Lucifer, who is of course Satan. Now you'll notice in 1595 the Antichrist is being taunted. 1596 the devil himself is being taunted. They are two different people. They're part of the unholy Trinity, and yet they're two separate beings, just so that's clear. Anyway, verse 12, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" Lucifer, as you know, was Satan's name before his fall. It talks about being fallen from heaven. And verse 13 talks about the pride of Lucifer. It says, "For thou hast said in my heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God." He thought he could be greater than God. And a third of the angels believed him, but he was quickly cast out. As I said before, there is no power greater than God. And then verse 15 it says, "Ye thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit." That is the ultimate destination of Satan. All right. Verses 16 through 19. Again, this is a taunting to the Antichrist, a mockery of the Antichrist. Only this taunting comes from the nations of the earth. These are all the living people. They're actually going to taunt the Antichrist after his fall. In verse 18, it says, all the kings of the nation, even all of them, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Let's go back to verse 16. It says, they that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake the kingdoms? Those are humans, living humans, talking about the Antichrist. They now see him as nothing. Yes, Christ. When Christ comes, he is just going to totally strip him of everything. You know, every bit of reverence, every bit of fear, every bit of control that the Antichrist once possessed. Then we go down to verse 18. It says, all the kings of the nation, even all of them, lie in glory, every one in his own house. Now, when a king passes away, you know, he is buried. He's buried, and there's a ceremony, and people will reverence him in generations past, talking about how great this king was. But verse 20 says, thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. The Antichrist will not be buried. He will not have a funeral. Instead, he will be cast alive into the lake of fire, according to Revelation 19, verse 20. Okay, and that's prophecy 1598, by the way. We then move down to 1599. This again talks about the desolation of Babylon. Which is very similar to what we discussed in chapter 13, verses 19 through 22. So there's really no need to go any further in detail. So we'll move on to verses 24 through 27. This talks about, this is God's oath to destroy the Antichrist. In verse 25, it talks about, I will break the Assyrian in my land. The Assyrian, as we discussed in last week's episode, refers to the Antichrist. And notice it says, in my land. You know, that's God saying my land. And upon my mountains. And tread him underfoot, then shall his yoke depart off of them, being Israel, and his burden shall depart off their shoulders. So God will completely break the yoke of control that is over Israel and really the whole world too. That's prophecy 1600. Okay. Verses 28 through 32. Now this talks about the impending destruction of the Philistine kingdom. Now I should point out this prophecy has nothing to do with what was covered elsewhere in chapter 14. Actually, these 4 verses should have been made their own chapter, but for whatever reasons, they were not. In any case, it says, in the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. Now, some 30 years ago, Ahaz's grandfather, King Uzziah, had defeated the armies of Philistia, which is now called Palestina, as in verse 29. Yes, the Philistines are now called the Palestinians, just so you know. Uzziah had killed them, and they've been bitter about that ever since, and been wanting to take revenge against the kingdom of Judah. And when King Ahaz reigned, that's exactly what happened. Ahaz was not a godly king, and as a result, the Philistines plundered a number of cities in Judah. But now Isaiah is saying to the Philistines, Ahaz is dead, and you're not going to have your way anymore, because now Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, a godly king, is assuming the throne, and he is going to defeat you. And that did come to pass. 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 8 tells about the fall of the Philistine army under King Hezekiah. Okay, we're now moving into chapters 15 and 16. These two chapters all deal with the fall of Moab. Moab, for those who don't know, Moab was a nation of people formed out of an ungodly relationship. For those who know about the story of Lot, after he and his daughters escaped from Sodom, the two daughters who had no husband, they wanted to have children to carry on the family line, so they got their father drunk and they laid with him, and they both bore sons out of that relationship. One son, his seed created the nation of Moab. So already the nation of Moab was cursed by God because of how they came into being, because incest, of course, is not condoned by God. And they also became enemies to the nation of Israel. So anyway, let's examine this. The entire chapter of 15, it outlines the cities of the Moab nation that are all going to fall and suffer, because when this invasion, they were invaded by the Assyrians in the 4th year of Hezekiah's reign. So anyway, it starts in verse 1. It says, Ker of Moab is laid in waste. Then in verse 2, he mentions Baeth and Dibon, Nebo, Medeba. And then verse 4, Heshbon, Eliah, Jahaz, and then in verse 5 it mentions Luhith and Horonaim, and just many cities. And the fact that Isaiah is naming specific cities by name makes this a very specific prophecy. Therefore, if any of these cities is untouched by Assyria, then the prophecy is false. But of course, it all came to pass as Isaiah said it. And then in verse 5, it said, "My heart shall cry out for Moab; his fugitives shall flee to Zoar." So that's a very specific place of refuge for the fugitives of Moab. That's prophecy 1603. And then finally, down here in verse 9, it says, "For the waters of Dimon," or Dimon, that's what it is, Dimon, I'm sorry, "shall be full of blood." That's prophecy 1604. Very specific river. It shall be full of blood from the slaughter of all the denizens of Moab. Okay. Chapter 16. Now, verses 1 through 5 now refers to Moab at the time of tribulation, in right around before the millennial kingdom. Here, Isaiah is prophesying that Moab will be a place of refuge for Israel during the time of the great tribulation. It says in verse 3, it says, "Take counsel," Isaiah is saying to Moab, "take counsel, execute judgment, make thy shadow as the night in the midst of noonday. Hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth. Let mine outcast, my outcasts, of course referring to Israel, dwell with thee, Moab. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler. That, of course, is the Antichrist. This was also prophesied in Psalm chapter 60, verses 6 through 12. The psalmist mentions a number of different nations, which will be part of Israel that time. And Moab is mentioned. It said, Moab is my washpot, meaning the land of Moab will belong to God, and he shall do with it as he chooses. And during the time of tribulation, he will chooses to use Moab as a place of refuge for Israel. Then in verse 5, this is prophecy 1606, and in mercy shall the throne be established, and he, the Messiah, shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hastening righteousness. So, this here we have another reference, one of many references and prophetic statements to the reign of Christ in the millennial kingdom in the tabernacle of David. Again, this is further evidence that Christ will reign in Israel. Okay. Verses 6 through 12, again, talks about Moab and its destruction. But what stands out, it says, Isaiah says that I will lament over Moab. Now, if Isaiah does not say I do lament over Moab, it says I will lament over Moab, meaning talking about a future event. So Isaiah is saying the destruction of Moab will happen in my lifetime because I am going to be around to lament it. Again, that's prophecy 1607. Okay, verses 13 and 14. This is prophecy 1608. This is the word that the Lord hath spoken concerning Moab since that time. But now the Lord hath spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the years of a hireling, and the glory of Moab shall be contemned with all that great multitude, and the remnant shall be very small and feeble. So Isaiah is saying this is going to happen within 3 years of me speaking this. And then you notice it also mentions a remnant. Well, you go back to chapter 15, verse 5, talks about fugitives fleeing to Zoar. This is, again, confirmation that some will survive the attack of the Assyrians. And as I said before, the Assyrians invaded during the 4th year of Hezekiah's reign. And that is all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us. Good day.
Okay. Yeah, that was actually off.